flatly refused to give up the small shed in the yard. She never allowed anyone to come near it, not neighbors, not even family. After her death, the new owners went inside for the first time, and what they found there left them speechless. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The old house stood at the edge of the village like a weary sentinel, its windows dimmed by time and its wooden porch sagging under the weight of decades. The neighbors had long since stopped wondering about the woman who lived there. Margaret Whitmore had become something of a legend, a name spoken in lowered voices by those who passed her gate. Children were warned not to cross the gravel path that led to her yard, and even the mailman preferred to slide letters through the fence rather than walk up to the porch. It wasn't that she was cruel, it was that she was absolute. She allowed no one near her home, and even less so near the small, weathered shed that sat beyond the orchard. People had tried to help her once. The local church women brought soup and bread during winter, but she never opened the door. The neighbor across the road, old Mr. Halper, offered to patch her roof when a storm tore through the valley, but she waved him off before he could lift a hammer. When the social worker from the county arrived to check on her welfare, Margaret stood behind the glass with her hand resting on a heavy cane and simply shook her head. The young woman understood and left without a word. From that day on, no one came uninvited again. Behind the main house, half hidden by overgrown apple trees, stood the shed. Its boards were gray and brittle, its tin roof pitted with rust. At night, however, it seemed alive. A faint, rhythmic ticking drifted from within. Steady, patient, never hurried. Some evenings, if the wind was just right, the sound carried all the way to the main road. Those who heard it often spoke later of the strange sensation it gave them. The ticking wasn't chaotic, like a dozen clocks mismatched and clattering against time. It was harmonious, as though every unseen mechanism inside followed a single invisible conductor. The sound began every night at the same hour, just after the sun slipped behind the hills and the crickets fell silent for a breath. The villagers came to call it the heartbeat of the orchard. And Margaret, who had not set foot in the town square for years, guarded that sound with the possessiveness of a mother. Once, a group of teenagers dared each other to look through the shed's cracks. They crept across her lawn under moonlight, their laughter muffled by nervous excitement. One of them, a lanky boy with freckles, managed to press his eye to a narrow gap between the boards. He saw nothing but a golden flicker and rows of metal glinting in the half-dark. But before he could call the others, the shed door shuddered. Margaret's voice cut through the night. Not shouting, not pleading, but filled with such force that it froze them where they stood. "Get away," she said, "not another step." They ran. The next morning, she left a note on the gatepost that simply read, "Never again." No one tested her after that. Those who lived nearby swore that the old woman kept something dangerous there. Perhaps tools from her late husband's workshop or chemicals too volatile to move. Others whispered of darker things. Some said she had hidden money. Others said bones. But none of them really believed their own stories. The truth was simpler and stranger. She refused to let go of whatever the shed contained, and her refusal had become sacred. Inside her house, time was measured by clocks. There were dozens scattered across every room. Mantel clocks, wall clocks, pocket watches mounted in small glass domes. Yet, curiously, none of them showed the same hour. They all ticked, each with its own rhythm, as if Margaret herself couldn't bear the unison of perfect time. When visitors, rare as they were, remarked on it years ago, She would smile faintly and say, if they all agreed, it would be the end of everything. No one ever asked what she meant. Every evening followed the same ritual. She would light the oil lamp in the kitchen, wind each clock once, and write a single line in a leather notebook kept beside her bed. Then, with the lamp in one hand and her cane in the other, she walked to the back door and gazed toward the orchard. The shed was visible from there, just a faint outline beneath the branches. She would stand for several minutes, listening, until the first faint tick reached her ears. Only then would she blow out the lamp and retreat to her chair. The ticking was her lullaby. There were reminders of the past scattered throughout the house, though most were hidden under dust and restraint. A photograph on the mantelpiece showed a young man with grease-stained hands and a grin full of life. He stood beside a sign that read, Whitmore and Sons Clockmakers. It was taken decades earlier, before the fire that took him and left Margaret alone. Beneath the photograph lay a small metal tag, its edges warped by heat, its engraved letters barely legible. She kept it polished nonetheless. The villagers sometimes saw her walking the perimeter of her property, leaning on her cane, pausing now and then to pick something small from the ground, a gear, a spring, a shard of glass, and slip it into her pocket. One curious child once asked her mother why the old lady collected trash. The woman had replied softly, "That's not trash, darling. That's her time." No one quite understood what she meant. Even animals seemed to sense that the boundaries of Margaret's land were different. Stray dogs barked at her gate but never entered. Birds rarely perched on the shed's roof. The air inside the orchard felt heavier somehow, denser, as though the ticking drained the sound of wind and replaced it with its own steady pulse. When autumn came, the trees dropped their fruit, but Margaret left them where they fell. Apples rotted beneath the branches, attracting wasps and a faint sweetness that lingered in the yard. She didn't care. She only cared that the shed remained undisturbed. Her son had not visited in over 40 years, and she liked it that way. The last letter she ever received from him lay folded inside the notebook by her bed. It was a single line in uneven handwriting. "Don't look for me." She never did. Years passed in that suspended rhythm. The world outside changed. New houses appeared down the lane. Street lights were installed. The postal service switched to electronic notifications. But none of it touched her. The villagers grew older. Children left for the city. And still the house stood, untamed and unmoved, anchored by the shed's secret heartbeat. On her final evening, Margaret followed her ritual exactly as she had for decades. She wound each clock, wrote a sentence in her notebook, and walked to the door. The orchard was black under the new moon, and the shed's outline seemed to breathe with the faintest pulse of amber light leaking from between its boards. The ticking began, slow at first, then layered, swelling into its familiar rhythm. She smiled, though her hands trembled. In her heart, she knew this would be the last night she'd hear it. She whispered something no one else would ever hear, turned off the lamp, and sat quietly in her chair. When the neighbors realized they hadn't seen her for several days, they called the constable. He found her seated near the window, her face calm, her eyes closed, as if she were listening to something far away. The clocks had all stopped. Every one of them showed the same time, 1:17. The news of her death spread quickly through the small village, but what lingered most was the silence that followed. For the first time in half a century, the orchard was still. The villagers waited for the ticking to return, but the nights remained empty. They thought it was over. They were wrong, because time, in its quiet way, was waiting for someone new to open the door. For almost a year after Margaret Whitmore's death, the house on the edge of the village sat untouched, its windows clouded with dust, its porch bowed under the weight of rain and silence. The orchard behind it grew wild, swallowing the paths she had once walked, and the shed stood like a sealed secret at the farthest corner of the yard. When the wind blew from the west, a faint metallic scent, oil and rust and age, would drift through the trees as though the earth itself exhaled her memory. The neighbors passed by quickly. No one wanted to linger near the fence where the ticking had once ruled the night. The constable who had found her body remembered the stillness most of all. Dozens of clocks hung from her walls, yet not one had moved since the night she died. They all stood frozen at the same hour, as if they had obeyed her final command. When her distant relatives arrived, a niece from the city and 2 grandsons she had never met, they treated the place like a museum of grief. They spoke in whispers, tiptoeing through the rooms, too cautious to disturb the air. None of them wanted to stay. They had come only to settle her affairs and to sell whatever could be sold. An auctioneer from the nearest town catalogued the furniture, paintings, and silver, but even he hesitated when he reached the shed. "You'll want that included?" he asked, pencil poised over his ledger. The niece frowned and looked toward the orchard. The shed loomed barely visible among the leaves, its tin roof catching the faintest glint of afternoon light. "No," she said quickly, her tone sharper than she meant it to be. "That thing can stay locked. My aunt was particular about it. Leave it be." The auctioneer didn't argue. He merely drew a line through his page and moved on. The following months brought rain, frost, and then the hesitant thaw of spring. With Margaret gone, the rhythm of the land changed. The orchard, once kept in tidy rows, grew wild and thick. Vines crept up the fence posts, and the grass near the shed rose knee-high. The villagers spoke less and less about the old woman, until her name became a part of the town's folklore, one of those stories that parents told to children who lingered outside after dark. "Come inside before the clocks start," they would say, half joking, half serious. When the Forsters arrived the next summer, they knew nothing of the whispers. Tom and Lily Forster were city people, tired of traffic, noise, and glass towers. The old house, offered for an impossibly low price, seemed like a promise of peace. They came with their 10-year-old daughter, Emily, in a van full of boxes, the air inside humming with optimism. The house looked tired but solid. Its peeling paint, its slanted porch, even the overgrown garden held a kind of rustic charm that made Lily smile. "It just needs love," she said, squeezing Tom's hand as they stepped out onto the gravel drive. They met the estate agent at the gate. A brisk woman with clipped speech, she handed over a heavy ring of keys, each labeled in fading ink. "You'll find one for every door," she said, "and the deed's already signed. Everything's in order." Tom nodded, flipping through the keys like cards. "And the shed?" he asked casually. The woman's smile faltered for just a heartbeat. "Oh, that old thing? I believe it's just storage. Been locked for years. Probably nothing of value in there." She adjusted her scarf and changed the subject. "You're very lucky, you know. Not many old places like this left standing." The Forsters spent their first day unpacking. Lily dusted the shelves and swept the floors while Tom tested the old electrical wiring and replaced the bulbs that still worked. Emily, curious and restless, ran from room to room, narrating discoveries to her parents, a hidden cupboard here, a creaky stair there. The house smelled faintly of old wood and lavender. the scent of something that refused to fade. When they sat down to dinner, the air felt peaceful, almost gentle, as though the house were exhaling after years of holding its breath. That night, Tom lay awake listening to the countryside. He wasn't used to the silence. No hum of traffic, no distant sirens, just the chirp of crickets and the whisper of leaves. It should have been common, but it wasn't. There was something else, faint but distinct, a rhythmic sound just below hearing. Tick, tick, tick. It seemed to come from far behind the house, near the orchard. He closed his eyes, trying to dismiss it as imagination, but the sound persisted. It wasn't constant. It faded and returned, as if syncing with his heartbeat. He eventually drifted to sleep, convinced it was just an old pipe settling somewhere in the walls. Morning brought sunlight through thin curtains and the sound of birds reclaiming the yard. The ticking was gone. Lily made coffee in the kitchen while Tom walked the perimeter of the property. He followed the narrow path past the apple trees until he reached the shed. It was smaller than he expected, no more than a single room, but solidly built, the boards sealed tight. The lock on the door was ancient, thick with rust. He tugged at it lightly. It didn't budge. The faint smell of oil and burnt metal hung in the air, subtle but strange. He noted it and walked back to the house. Later that afternoon, as they sorted through the papers left by the previous owner, Lily noticed something odd. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the deed. The description of the property listed the house, the orchard, and a barn, but there was no mention of a shed. "Maybe it's too small to matter," she suggested. Tom shrugged, though a small unease crept through him. The omission felt deliberate. As the days passed, they began to settle in. The house had its quirks, a door that refused to close properly, a window that whistled when the wind came from the south, but nothing they couldn't handle. Emily found friends among the neighboring children and spent her afternoons exploring the orchard. She came home one evening with dirt on her knees and a puzzled look on her face. "There's a box behind the shed," she said, "like a little chest with flowers on it, but someone nailed it shut." Lily smiled indulgently. "Don't play near there, sweetheart. You might get hurt." Emily nodded but looked unconvinced. The second week brought rain. The sound of it on the tin roof was comforting at first, a soft patter that filled the empty spaces of the old house. But as night deepened, Tom woke again to that same steady rhythm beneath the rain. Tick, tick, tick. He sat up, heart thudding. It was louder now, unmistakable. He crossed to the window and peered into the darkness. Beyond the blurred outline of trees, a dim glimmer flickered, just for a second, like a match being struck and snuffed out. He rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, the light was gone. He told Lily about it in the morning, but she dismissed it gently. "Old pipes, old wood. This place probably breathes at night." He smiled at her reasoning, but it didn't sit right. He checked the shed again, circling it this time. There were faint grooves in the dirt, as if something heavy had been dragged from the door to the orchard. He crouched, tracing the marks with his fingers, then straightened quickly, feeling foolish. Old debris, he told himself, nothing more. By the end of the month, they had begun to feel at home. Lily painted the kitchen a soft cream. Tom mowed the grass, and Emily hung drawings on her bedroom walls. Yet the nights remained uneasy. Some were silent, others filled with that faint, impossible ticking. Once, around midnight, the sound changed. It became layered, as though more than one source pulsed at once, like a chorus of unseen clocks tuning themselves to a secret rhythm. It lasted for exactly 34 minutes, and then stopped. Tom wrote down the time without knowing why. It was 1:17. The next morning, he mentioned it to the mailman, an older man who had delivered letters in the area for 30 years. The man paled slightly at the mention of the hour. "She kept that time," he muttered. "Always did, never changed her clocks." When Tom asked who he meant, the mailman only said, "The woman before you, the one who built that shed. She's been gone a while now. Don't go prying into her business." He tipped his hat and walked away. Lily laughed when Tom repeated the conversation. "You're letting country tales get to you," she said. "Every village has its ghosts." But that night, when the ticking returned louder than ever, she found herself sitting up too, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting each beat. When it stopped, the house felt emptier than before. Summer turned to early autumn, the orchard gave its last apples, and the days shortened. The shed remained locked, indifferent to the family living around it. Yet, with each passing night, Tom felt the presence of that silent space growing stronger, like a question waiting to be asked. He could ignore it no longer. On the final Sunday of September, he stood in the backyard at dusk, the air cool and still. The trees swayed gently, and the shed seemed to stare back at him. "It's just a building," he whispered. But even as he said it, he felt the absurdity of the words. The lock gleamed faintly in the fading light, untouched for decades, its key long vanished. Behind the door, time was waiting, ticking softly, patiently, as it always had, waiting for the next pair of hands to wind it once more. The first frost came earlier than expected that year, laying a thin veil of silver over the orchard and turning the shed into a dark, silent monolith under the pale moonlight. The air grew crisp, sharp enough to make every sound travel farther, every whisper linger a little longer than it should. The Forsters had now lived in the old house for several months, long enough for it to feel familiar by day, but at night the place still belonged to someone else. The ticking, once faint and irregular, had grown stronger. It came not every night, but often enough that it became part of their rhythm, like a ghostly metronome marking time no one could quite keep up with. It always began just after midnight. Sometimes Tom would already be awake when it started, as if his body had learned to expect it. Other nights, the sound would pull him from sleep like an unseen hand tapping on his shoulder. Tick, tick, tick. The rhythm was deliberate, not random, and always distant, coming from behind the orchard, through the window pane, through the very marrow of the walls. On calm nights, it was soft, almost shy. On windy ones, it rose like a warning, blending with the rustle of branches until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He tried to ignore it at first. He told himself it was nothing more than an old clock mechanism, perhaps something buried under the shed, left behind by the previous owner. Yet, the longer he listened, the less that explanation satisfied him. There was something alive in that sound, something that felt deliberate and personal. When he mentioned it to Lily, she nodded patiently, as though humoring a child's fear. "Old wood," she said again, though she didn't meet his eyes. "You'll get used to it." But Lily hadn't been sleeping either. She heard it too, sometimes faintly, sometimes clear as rain. And though she said nothing more, she began to close the curtains tighter at night and double-check the back door. Emily, their daughter, seemed strangely unbothered by it. One morning, she came down to breakfast and asked, "Did you hear Grandma's clocks last night?" Her voice was calm, almost cheerful, as she reached for her cereal. Tom froze. "What did you say?" She shrugged. "Grandma, the one who lived here before. I heard her walking in the garden. The clocks were talking to her." Lily's spoon clattered against her cup. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked softly. "No one said she was a grandmother?" Emily just smiled and said she didn't know. That night, neither Tom nor Lily slept at all. They lay awake, listening, waiting, and right on cue, the ticking began, slow, even, like a breath. Tom rose quietly, wrapped himself in his coat, and went to the back window. The moon hung low, silvering the orchard in soft light. For a long moment, there was nothing but trees and frost. Then he saw movement, a flicker of shadow at the far end of the garden. It wasn't distinct, just a shape gliding between the trees, pale against the dark. He leaned closer, heart thudding, but before he could focus, it was gone. The next morning, he walked the orchard, tracing the narrow path that led to the shed. The ground was cold and brittle beneath his boots. Near the door, he found footprints. Not his, not Lily's. They were smaller, lighter, but too large for Emily. The impressions were shallow but fresh, as though someone had been standing there for a long time. He crouched to study them, but the wind erased their edges before he could be sure. When he told Lily, she grew pale and suggested calling the police, but he hesitated. What could he possibly say? That ghosts were leaving tracks in his yard? That the dead woman's clocks were still running beneath the ground? That afternoon, Tom went into town. He visited the small grocery and, after buying some tools and nails, mentioned casually that he had bought the Whitmore property. The shopkeeper's eyes flickered with recognition. "Ah," he said slowly, "Margaret's place." He lowered his voice. "You'll want to keep clear of that shed, friend. She never let anyone near it, not even her own kin." Tom forced a laugh. "I heard she was eccentric." The man's expression didn't change. "Eccentric, sure, but I remember when the constable found her. Whole house full of clocks, they say. Not one ticking. Every single one stopped at the same time." He paused, then added almost reluctantly, "People say she could make them tick again when she wanted, that she could start time and stop it just by listening." Tom thanked him and left, but the words followed him all the way home. That evening, as he stepped out of his car, he thought he heard the faint click of metal behind him. The sound came from the direction of the shed. He turned sharply, flashlight in hand, but the yard was empty. The shed stood still, its padlock glinting like a blind eye. He walked toward it, half angry, half afraid, and placed his hand on the cold iron clasp. It was locked, as always. He tried to shake the door. It groaned but held firm. From inside there was silence, perfect and absolute. He exhaled, his breath fogging in the air, and turned to leave. That was when he heard it. Not the ticking this time, but a faint, measured hum, deep and low, like a machine gathering itself for motion. It lasted no more than 2 seconds, but it was enough to make him step back. Then it stopped, leaving only his heartbeat pounding in his ears. For the next few nights, he tried to record the sound. He set his phone by the window, facing the orchard, and pressed record before bed. In the morning, he would find the recordings filled with static, as if the air itself rebelled against being captured. Once, he caught a faint pattern, a rhythmic pulse buried under the noise, but the more he listened, the less it sounded mechanical. It was too organic, too deliberate, almost like a whisper turned into rhythm. Lily began waking earlier, drawn to the kitchen window that overlooked the trees. She rarely said anything now, but her face had grown pale, her eyes hollow with sleeplessness. "We need to go," she said one morning. Just for a while. Maybe to my sister's. Tom agreed out loud, but knew he wouldn't leave. He couldn't. The mystery of the shed had gripped him too tightly. It wasn't fear anymore. It was fascination, a terrible curiosity that felt stronger than common sense. The villagers noticed, of course. They saw the lights burning late in the Forsters' windows and whispered that the house had claimed them as it did its previous owner. One evening, old Mr. Halper stopped by to deliver a basket of apples. As Tom thanked him, the old man's eyes drifted toward the orchard. "You keep the door locked, I hope," he said. "She didn't like it opened." Tom asked what he meant, and the man replied, "Margaret. She said it kept the world in balance, that if anyone went in there without her, everything would fall apart." Tom tried to laugh it off, but the way the old man's voice trembled turned the sound hollow. Autumn deepened. The trees turned gold, then brown. The days shortened into gray evenings, heavy with mist. Inside the house, the ticking grew stronger still. Sometimes it began before midnight, sometimes after, but always it lingered around the same hour, 1:17. Emily started sleepwalking. They found her twice standing by the back door, staring out toward the orchard. When Lily asked what she was doing, she said, "The lady's calling me. She says the clocks are lonely." They locked the door after that, but it didn't stop the dreams. Emily began sketching pictures of gears and dials, though she'd never seen the inside of a clock. One particularly cold night, Tom couldn't stand it anymore. He went outside with a flashlight, his breath forming ghosts in the air. The ticking was there, clear as ever, threading through the stillness like the pulse of a hidden heart. It came from the shed, but also from the ground itself, as if the soil remembered every sound it had ever swallowed. He crouched and pressed his ear to the earth. For a heartbeat, the rhythm synced perfectly with his own. Then something changed. The ticking faltered, then doubled. 2 separate beats, one fast, one slow, like 2 clocks arguing over who would keep time. When he lifted his head, he realized the shed door was trembling ever so slightly, not enough to open, but enough to make the padlock quiver on its hinge. He backed away slowly, the flashlight beam wavering over the wooden boards. The light caught on something carved into the wood, marks he hadn't noticed before. They were faint, nearly erased by weather, but the pattern was unmistakable. Small circular indentations forming the outline of a clock face. Its hands were carved to point at 1:17. He didn't tell Lily what he saw. He couldn't explain it himself, but that night he lay awake until the sound began again, softer this time, almost tender. And as he listened, something in the rhythm changed. It wasn't random anymore. It was spelling something, though he couldn't understand how. A sequence of short and long beats repeating over and over. He didn't know it yet, but it was Morse code. Later, he would learn what it said. For now, he simply listened, the hairs on his arms rising as if the house itself were breathing beside him. The last thing he remembered before sleep took him was the feeling that someone was standing just outside the window, listening to the same sound. When he woke before dawn, the ticking had stopped, and the frost on the glass bore the faint outline of a hand. By morning, the marks were gone, but the sense of being watched remained. The Forsters' quiet country home no longer felt like a refuge. It had become something else, an echo chamber where time replayed its own secrets. And as Tom stood at the kitchen window, staring out toward the shed, he knew that whatever waited behind that locked door had begun to wake up again. The night the lock finally broke was one of those damp, windless nights when the air itself seemed to be listening. The village slept under a low sky, thick with mist, and every branch in the orchard sagged with the weight of silence. Tom had been pacing the house for hours, unable to rest. The sound had come again, sharper than before. No longer the faint, measured ticking he had grown used to, but a metallic clatter beneath it. A grinding like gears forced to move after decades of stillness. Lily had begged him not to go outside, but her words faded into the hum of the clocks that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Emily was asleep upstairs, or at least they hoped she was. Tom's hand shook as he reached for the flashlight. "I just need to see it," he said quietly. "I need to know what's in there." He crossed the yard in boots slick with dew. The grass swallowed his steps, and the cold clung to his breath like fog. The shed waited at the far end of the orchard, the padlock gleaming faintly in the pale light. The closer he came, the louder the sound grew, not chaotic but pulsing, as if the building itself were breathing through the gaps in its wood. The flashlight beam danced across the door, catching on the rusty metal clasp and the uneven grain of the boards. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, he raised the crowbar he had brought with him and struck the lock. The first blow sent a hollow clang into the night. The second snapped one of the hinges. On the third, the metal gave way with a dull crack, and the door sagged inward. A stale breath of air escaped, thick with oil, dust, and something sweetly metallic. Tom hesitated again, fighting the urge to step back. The ticking stopped. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, revealing the impossible. The walls were covered in clocks, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, mounted in rows like sentinels. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, mantle clocks, even wristwatches hung by their straps. Some were polished and gleaming, others rusted and half dismantled, but every single one was running. Their faces shone with the same pallid reflection of the light, their hands moving in quiet defiance of the years they had been sealed away. The sound that filled the room was immense, overwhelming, a symphony of time keeping itself alive. On the far side stood a workbench covered in papers, tools, and fragments of brass. Drawings lay scattered among open tins of oil and glass jars full of screws and gears. The air smelled of grease and something older, like parchment and burnt wood. A small box sat at the center of the table, its lid engraved with the words, "For those whom time did not return." Tom's hand trembled as he brushed the dust away. Inside were scraps of paper with names written in careful script, names he didn't recognize. There were also tiny, oblong tags of brass, each engraved with a different hour. 1:17 appeared more than once. Behind the workbench, against the back wall, stood a shape he hadn't seen at first glance, a long, rectangular object draped in a sheet. The cloth was gray and brittle, its edges darkened by age. Something about its size and its stillness sent a shiver through him. He stepped closer and reached for the covering. As he pulled it back, the air grew colder. Beneath the sheet lay a coffin. It was old, wooden, reinforced with metal bands tarnished by time. A soft film of dust dulled its surface, except for the center, where the wood was clean, as though someone had been wiping it regularly. The faint smell of wax hung in the air. He dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, the beam spinning over the walls until it came to rest on the far corner of the room. There, near the floor, he noticed a seam in the boards, almost invisible but too precise to be natural. He crouched, pressed his fingers along the edge, and felt a metal handle embedded in the wood. When he pulled, a section of the floor lifted with a reluctant creak, revealing a narrow opening beneath. A draft of cold air rose from below, carrying with it the faint scent of stone and something else, something earthy, like soil that had been turned and packed by human hands. He leaned over the opening, but the light barely reached the bottom. He could see the start of a staircase, wooden steps spiraling into the dark. His mind screamed to stop, to call someone, to close the door and never come back. But something deeper, something he didn't want to name, pushed him forward. He descended slowly, his hand brushing the damp wall for balance. The sound of the clocks above grew distant until it was replaced by a low hum that seemed to come from the very ground. When his feet touched the basement floor, the light finally revealed what lay below. The room was small but meticulously ordered, every inch used. Along the walls were shelves filled with tools, jars, and small mechanisms. But the center of the room held something else. A great iron frame supporting 3 enormous clocks, each unlike any he had ever seen. Their faces were plain, their glass darkened by age, but their pendulums swung in perfect unison. Between them, a wooden stool stood facing a small table. Upon it rested a photograph of a man and a woman smiling, their hands stained with grease. Tom recognized the woman instantly. It was Margaret Whitmore, younger, her eyes bright and unburdened. The man beside her must have been her husband. His expression was confident but gentle, his arm draped around her shoulders. Behind them, half-finished clocks lined a workshop wall. Tom's throat tightened. The faint humming that filled the basement came from somewhere near the floor, where a generator of some kind sat covered in dust but still vibrating faintly. Wires ran from it to the clocks, up the walls, and through holes that led back to the shed above. The air was warmer here, the kind of warmth that doesn't come from heat but from something alive, working, persistent. He stepped closer to the table and saw the journals piled beside the photograph. Their pages were brittle, yellowed, and filled with neat handwriting. He flipped through the first one, catching fragments of sentences. He built them for everyone he loved, each one a heartbeat in brass. Another line read, "I told him they would outlive us. I never imagined how right I'd be." And then, a final entry, the ink darker and heavier than the rest. "The fire took him, but not all of him. I kept what remained, and I made him whole again." A chill passed through Tom's spine. He turned to the coffin behind him. The air seemed to thicken, as though the room itself waited for him to understand. His gaze fell to the floor. Thin scuff marks surrounded the coffin, the kind that come from movement. Someone had been down here long after the rest of the world thought it sealed. The faint hum of the generator deepened, its rhythm aligning with his heartbeat. He stepped back, overwhelmed. Above him, a sudden noise shattered the stillness. The sound of footsteps echoed from the shed, followed by Lily's voice calling his name. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his breath short, and pushed open the hatch. Lily stood in the doorway, pale and trembling. "Tom," she whispered, "why are all the clocks—" But she didn't finish. Her gaze fell on the coffin. "Oh my God!" He took her hand, unsure of what to say. "It's him," he murmured finally. "Her husband, the one who died in the fire." Lily's eyes darted around the room, taking in the rows of ticking clocks, the scattered papers, the open hatch. "We have to call someone," she said. "We can't just— This isn't right." But before they could move, a sound rolled through the air, a deep, resonant chime that silenced every clock at once. The hands on the nearest wall clock trembled, then began to spin wildly. The light from the flashlight flickered, and for a moment Tom thought he saw movement beneath the surface of the coffin's wood, a faint shift like breath beneath linen. Then everything stopped. The hands froze. The light steadied. The shed returned to its heavy silence as though nothing had happened. Tom reached for Lily's arm. "We're leaving," he said, and this time she didn't argue. They ran back to the house, locking the door behind them. But even as they sat together in the dark, the faint echo of the chime lingered in the air. Hours passed before they spoke again. When dawn came, they returned to the shed, expecting to find the door ajar, the clock stilled. But it was closed, the lock hanging neatly in place as though it had never been broken. Inside, through the cracks in the wood, the steady ticking had returned. Tom tried to convince himself it was all in his mind, that fatigue and fear had twisted what he saw. Yet, as the day wore on, small details refused to let him forget. His crowbar lay on the porch where he'd dropped it, its tip blackened with something that looked like ash. The padlock on the shed door was whole again, but newer, as if freshly forged, and when he checked the time on his watch, the hands had stopped, frozen impossibly at 1:17. That evening, as the light faded and the orchard sank into shadow, the sound came again. The ticking was back to its familiar rhythm, calm and deliberate, but now Tom could hear something beneath it, a slow, steady pulse, as if the shed itself had learned to breathe. The morning after the shed revealed its secrets, the Forsters woke to a silence that felt heavier than sleep. The air in the house seemed to have thickened overnight, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The orchard outside lay still beneath a washed-out sky, and the shed stood where it always had, modest, unassuming, and utterly untrustworthy. Yet, despite the ordinary calm of daylight, Tom and Lily both knew that something had changed. The discovery of the coffin had drawn a line between before and after, and now everything felt different. Neither of them spoke as they prepared breakfast. The kettle hissed, the toast burned, and Emily hummed softly to herself, oblivious to the weight that had settled over her parents. Tom tried to focus on the ordinary: coffee, sunlight, the faint smell of apples, but his mind kept returning to the dim room below the shed, to the photograph of Margaret and her husband, to the words scrawled in that brittle old journal. The fire took him, but not all of him. I kept what remained, and I made him whole again. He hadn't told Lily everything. He hadn't told her that the coffin hadn't been sealed properly. He hadn't told her that the hinges had been oiled recently, that the dust around it had been disturbed. There had been fingerprints, too, thin, fragile marks on the wooden surface, as though someone had touched it with shaking hands not long ago, and the thought that Margaret, the old woman buried nearly a year ago, might have been down there tending to that coffin until her final days filled him with an unease he could neither name nor shake. After breakfast, Lily tried to call the authorities. She got as far as explaining that there was a coffin in their shed before her voice faltered. The man on the other end, polite but impatient, told her that if the deceased had been properly buried, any discovery on private land would need to be reported to the county clerk first. Could be historical remains, he said, sounding more bored than curious. File a notice and someone will come by in a few weeks. Lily hung up without replying. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at her hands. That night, they decided not to talk about it at all. The clocks began their ritual ticking again around midnight, slow and steady, and the sound crept into their dreams. In his sleep, Tom saw fire. Bright, hungry flames devouring wood and metal, the air filled with the crackle of things breaking apart, He saw a man in the middle of it, trying to save something. Perhaps the clocks, perhaps the workshop itself. And then the roof came down, and everything turned to light. When he woke, his shirt was damp with sweat, and his watch had stopped again at 1:17. In the following days, the ticking no longer came only at night. It began faintly in the mornings, a whispering undercurrent to the wind, a low hum beneath the creak of the house. Sometimes it came from the orchard, sometimes from beneath the floorboards. The shed door, which had repaired itself, or been repaired, remained closed, the padlock dull but firm. Yet Tom noticed that the marks around it changed from day to day. Sometimes there were footprints in the mud, though he hadn't been there. Once, he found a fresh oil stain on the doorframe as if a machine had been serviced recently. On the third day, he returned to the shed with his tools. Lily refused to go with him, and Emily was sent to stay with the neighbors. He didn't tell his wife what he planned, but she knew. She watched from the window as he crossed the orchard, the cold light of afternoon catching on the crowbar in his hand. He didn't break the lock this time. He simply stood before the door and spoke quietly, as though to another person. "I need to understand," he said. "I won't take anything. I just need to know the truth." Then he turned the handle. To his surprise, the door opened. Inside, the air was warmer than before, filled with the scent of oil and wood polish. The clocks were all running again, their pendulums swaying in perfect synchrony. On the workbench, the journals were stacked neatly, their edges aligned, though he was certain he'd left them scattered. The coffin still stood against the wall, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. He approached the table and opened the first journal again. This time, he read more carefully. The entries stretched across decades, written in the same neat, deliberate hand. The first pages described Margaret's husband, Edgar Whitmore, a clockmaker whose small workshop in the nearby town had been his pride. He was known for his precision, for the way he treated each mechanism as if it were alive. "Every clock," he once told his apprentices, "has its own heart. The trick is to listen until you hear it beat." He had 2 assistants, both young men from the village, and, for a time, business thrived. But then came the fire. The journals described it not as an accident, but as something darker, something Margaret had spent years trying not to name. "He trusted too much," she wrote in one entry. "He believed kindness could make a man honest, but greed burns faster than wood." Another page, smudged and incomplete, told of how her son, their only child, had fallen in with gamblers, how he had stolen from his father's workshop to pay his debts, how the missing parts had been discovered. "Edgar would have forgiven him," she wrote. "He went back for the boy. He never came out." The fire had started in the small hours of the morning. 3 people had died: Edgar, 1 apprentice, and an unknown third man who was never identified. The police called it accidental, a faulty lamp, nothing more. But Margaret knew. She knew her son had said it, perhaps not meaning to, perhaps desperate, but the guilt of that knowledge crushed her. "They told me his body was too damaged to bury," she wrote. "I couldn't accept that. I went to the site myself when the ashes cooled. I found pieces, metal, bone, brass, enough to know he had been real. I took him home." Tom stopped reading. The words blurred before his eyes. He glanced towards the coffin, his stomach tightening. It was closed as before, but he felt a pull to open it, to confirm what he already feared. He placed a trembling hand on the lid and pressed. The wood was smooth, recently oiled. Beneath his palm, he thought he felt the faintest vibration, like the hum of a machine. He stepped back quickly, heart hammering. In the journal's later pages, Margaret wrote of how she began to build. "If time could take him," she wrote, "then I would make time give him back." She used the remains of his workshop, the burnt gears, the melted springs, the fragments of tools, and began crafting clocks unlike any other. Each one was a memorial, a promise to the dead. "One for Edgar," she wrote, "one for Thomas, and one for Henry. 3 souls bound in time." She placed the clocks in the shed, connected them to a small generator she'd salvaged from the town's scrapyard. At first, they didn't work. Then, one night, they began to tick. She didn't know why. She only knew that when they did, she felt him near her again. "He speaks through them," she wrote. "His hands, his breath, his pulse, they live in the rhythm." Tom closed the book, his hands shaking. He understood now what the shed had become. It wasn't a workshop anymore. It was a tomb built from guilt and devotion. Margaret had turned it into a reliquary of her husband's memory, a place where love and sin had fused into something mechanical and eternal. But there was still one thing he couldn't explain: the third body, the unknown man. The newspapers had called him the Stranger. But in one of the last entries, written in a trembling hand, Margaret confessed the truth. "The third was my son," she wrote. "He returned that night. I buried him with his father. I could not let the world judge him. Time will be his keeper now." Tom felt the blood drain from his face. He looked again at the coffin and imagined the impossible weight of what lay inside: the husband, the son, the fire, all sealed together in one final act of penance. He turned to leave, but as he did, one of the clocks struck once, clear, sharp, deliberate. The others followed, one by one, until the room was filled with sound. They didn't strike the hour. They struck the truth. The hands on every face aligned perfectly at 1:17, and then the pendulum stopped. When Tom stepped outside, the world had changed color. The orchard shimmered faintly in the pale afternoon light, as though time itself had slowed. The house in the distance looked smaller, older, almost fragile. He stood there for a long time, listening to the sudden quiet. When Lily came running from the house, calling his name, he couldn't speak. He simply pointed back toward the shed. "It's all of them," he whispered. "They're all in there." That night, the clocks began again. Not loud, not insistent, but soft, like a heartbeat under the floor. And for the first time, Tom thought he understood what Margaret had been trying to do: not to summon the dead, not to trap them, but to make time remember them, so that forgetting would never finish what the fire had started. The days that followed were unlike any the Forsters had ever known. The discovery inside the shed, those journals, that coffin, the truth of the fire, had not simply unsettled them. It had rearranged their understanding of everything that surrounded them. The house no longer seemed to belong entirely to the living, and the air within it had changed, gaining weight, as if the past itself had crept in and refused to leave. Even sunlight filtering through the windows felt slower, more deliberate, as though time was learning how to move again within the boundaries of Margaret's world. Tom stopped going to work. He told himself he needed a few days to think, but he couldn't tear himself away from the property. Every sound, every creak, every gust of wind seemed tied to the rhythm of the shed. Lily pretended to continue with her routines, making meals, cleaning rooms, but her movements had become hollow, mechanical, like someone mimicking life without feeling it. Only Emily seemed unchanged, wandering through the orchard as if guided by something she couldn't name. When Tom caught her standing near the shed one afternoon, she said, "It's nice when they're all talking at once. It sounds like rain inside a cave. That night, Tom decided he couldn't leave things half understood. He waited until the house fell silent, then took a lantern and returned to the shed. The padlock, as before, was closed and gleaming. But when he reached for it, it came loose in his hand, unlatched, as though someone had already been there. The door swung open with a sigh, and the warm, oily air inside embraced him like an old friend. The clocks ticked in unison, hundreds of them, their rhythm steady and sure. He descended the hatch again, down the spiral of damp steps into the small chamber beneath. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The three great clocks in the center stood exactly as before, their pendulums moving like lungs, inhaling and exhaling in perfect measure. But this time, the space around them seemed alive with a faint glow, a kind of amber radiance that came from the friction of their motion. He felt the vibration of their ticking through the soles of his shoes. The air itself seemed to pulse. On the table, Margaret's journals lay open, the pages fluttering as if stirred by an invisible hand. The photograph of her and Edgar watched him with the same quiet certainty. There was peace in her eyes in that picture, a peace he couldn't reconcile with the haunted woman described by neighbors, the one who chased away visitors and locked herself from the world. He wondered how much of that was guilt and how much was devotion. He wondered whether the difference even mattered anymore. Tom found himself drawn to the mechanical centerpiece of the room, a tangle of brass arms, pulleys, and counterweights connecting the three central clocks to a lattice of wires and rods that reached up into the ceiling. He followed them with his eyes, realizing they disappeared into small conduits that likely led to the clocks upstairs in the house itself. The system wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost mathematical. Someone had designed it with care, connecting every timepiece on the property to these three hearths below. It was as if Margaret had given each clock in her home a pulse derived from this source. He traced the connections further and discovered a small control panel built into the far wall. It was primitive, but functional. Switches, knobs, and two copper dials. One was marked amplitude, the other harmonic sync. Both were set at their lowest levels. A worn note had been tacked beside them in Margaret's hand. Increase only at 117. Never before. Never after. He didn't understand what it meant, but the warning in her words was clear. Still, curiosity gnawed at him, a compulsion that had nothing to do with reason. The need to see what would happen, to hear what sound might emerge from the beating heart of that room, overwhelmed caution. His fingers trembled as he turned the first dial slightly. The sound in the chamber changed immediately. The tick became deeper, resonant, almost musical. The second dial followed, and a low vibration shuddered through the air. For a moment, Tom thought the walls themselves were moving. Then he heard a faint whisper behind him. He spun around, expecting to find Lily standing there, but he was alone. The whisper came again, barely audible over the growing hum of the clocks. It wasn't a word, more a sigh shaped by breath. The photograph on the table trembled, the lantern flame stretched toward it, and the air grew warmer. Then, from somewhere deep within the machinery, a single chime rang, clear, soft, and heartbreakingly human. Tom froze. Every instinct told him to stop, to pull back, to leave the dials as they were, but he couldn't. Something in the sound held him captive. It wasn't frightening. It was sad, profoundly, terribly sad. He thought of Margaret, spending decades alone, winding these clocks, talking to them as though they could answer. Perhaps, in some impossible way, they had. Perhaps she had succeeded in making time remember her husband, in stitching together fragments of him through the rhythm of gears and pendulums. The clocks were no longer just machines. They were repositories of emotion, of devotion so powerful it had blurred the line between living and remembering. Tom lowered the dials slowly. The glow faded and the whisper disappeared, leaving only the ordinary ticking. He sat on the steps for a long time, his hands buried in his hair, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. When he finally climbed back to the surface, dawn was breaking. The orchard was wrapped in mist, and for the first time, the shed felt peaceful rather than ominous. He locked the door again, but kept the key in his pocket. When he told Lily what had happened, she didn't question him. She listened silently, her face pale, her eyes dark. When he finished, she simply said, "Then maybe it isn't our place to stop it. Maybe it's hers." He understood what she meant. The shed was no longer a secret to be solved or a danger to be feared. It was a monument, a system of memory that belonged to someone who had refused to let love die. In the days that followed, Tom began to care for the clocks. He oiled the hinges, wiped the dust, and checked the pendulums. He didn't know why he did it. It felt instinctive, like continuing someone else's ritual. Lily joined him sometimes, standing quietly in the doorway, her expression softer now, her fear replaced by reverence. The ticking, once unbearable, became comforting, a rhythm that grounded their days. Even Emily seemed calmer. She spent long afternoons drawing pictures of clocks and people holding hands, filling pages with looping gears and hearts that looked like cogs. Then, one afternoon, Tom found a small metal plaque hidden behind one of the wall clocks. It was engraved with names, dozens of them. Some he recognized from the journals, others from the gravestones in the village cemetery. Next to each name was a date, and next to each date, a small carved symbol resembling a clock hand. At the bottom of the plaque, in faint letters, was the inscription, "They all keep time here." That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the orchard, Tom returned to the shed. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stood listening. The clocks greeted him like a chorus, their beats weaving into a single, steady rhythm. He realized then that they weren't just memorials to Margaret's husband and son. Each one was dedicated to someone else who had died in the village, friends, neighbors, people whose passing she had marked in silence. Every time a new clock was built, it wasn't just remembrance, it was resurrection through rhythm. He understood now why she had guarded the place so fiercely. The shed was her chapel, the clocks her congregation. She had given each soul a sound to live by. When the hour came, that night, 1:17, Tom and Lily were both awake, sitting by the window. They heard the chime roll through the orchard like a breath drawn from another world. It wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the house. Then, as always, silence followed. But the next night, the rhythm changed. The ticking quickened for a few moments before settling back into pace. It felt almost like excitement. When Tom visited the shed the following morning, he found something new, a small unfinished clock resting on the workbench, its parts laid out carefully as if waiting for assembly. He hadn't placed it there, nor had Lily, yet there it was, a brass casing, a pendulum, and a small dial with no numbers, only a faint engraving on its surface for those yet to be remembered. He didn't know how to react. Perhaps it had always been there, buried under other things. Perhaps memory was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he understood what it meant. The shed wasn't finished. Margaret's work had never been meant to end with her death. It had been meant to continue, carried forward by whoever found it next. That evening, Tom assembled the clock. He worked by lamplight, guided not by skill but by instinct. The parts fit together easily, almost eagerly, as though they knew where they belonged. When it was done, he placed it on the shelf beside the others. For a moment, it was silent. Then it began to tick, softly at first, then stronger, until it joined the collective heartbeat of the room. Lily came to stand beside him. She didn't speak. Together they listened to the symphony of time that surrounded them. The fear that had once defined the shed was gone. In its place was a strange serenity, the sense of being part of something larger and older than themselves. They left the door open that night, letting the rhythm drift through the orchard and into the house. From that day forward, Tom no longer thought of the clocks as Margaret's burden. They were her gift, her way of ensuring that time itself could remember the dead, not as names carved in stone, but as sounds that could still move the air. Each night at 1:17, when the great chime resonated through the walls, he imagined her there, sitting at her workbench, winding the pendulums with steady hands, whispering to those she had loved. And as the months passed, the Forsters no longer felt like strangers in the house. They had become its keepers, caretakers of the rhythm that bridged life and memory. Even Emily seemed to understand. Sometimes she would stop what she was doing and tilt her head, smiling softly, as if listening to someone only she could hear. The shed stood quiet by day, alive by night. And though Tom never again touched the dials on the panel, he knew that if he ever did, if he ever increased the amplitude at 1:17, the clocks might speak once more, not with words, but with the pulse of every soul that time refused to erase. Winter arrived quietly that year, settling over the village in a muted hush that softened everything but the sound of the clocks. Snow covered the orchard like a white shroud, yet from the shed came that steady, patient rhythm, untouched by cold or wind. The Forsters had grown accustomed to it by now. The ticking had become part of their lives, as ordinary as breath. And yet, beneath the comfort it offered, there was something else. A quiet reverence, a sense that they were living inside someone else's unfinished prayer. Tom often thought about Margaret when he wound the clocks each week. He imagined her sitting in this same chair by the workbench, her hands wrinkled but sure, the glow of the oil lamp turning her face golden. He could almost hear her murmuring to the clocks, asking them to hold time steady for just one more day. The thought no longer frightened him. It humbled him. There was a purity to her obsession that he had come to understand. She hadn't built these machines to defy death. She had built them to make peace with it, to give loss a language that could continue speaking after her own voice had faded. Lily had stopped suggesting they sell the house. She seemed calmer now, moving through her days with a sense of quiet purpose. She had taken to tending the orchard, pruning the branches Margaret had once ignored. "Everything here deserves care," she said once, brushing snow from a branch heavy with frost. "Even the things that can't grow anymore." Tom smiled and didn't argue. It was as if the place itself had absorbed some of the woman's stubborn devotion. The land no longer felt haunted. It felt inhabited, watched over. Each night, just before 1:17, the rhythm of the clocks would shift. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then the great chime would roll softly through the orchard, reaching every corner of the house. The sound was gentle now, neither mournful nor eerie, but steady and certain, a heartbeat of brass and wood that tied past to present. Sometimes Tom would wake to find Emily standing at her window, watching the shed from her room. She never looked afraid. Once, when he asked what she saw, she said, "They're just talking, Daddy. They talk to each other when it's quiet." As the snow deepened, word of the clock spread through the village. Neighbors stopped by to ask if it was true that they all still worked, that the shed lit up at night. Tom never invited them inside, but he didn't deny it. He told them the truth as he understood it, that the clocks were built in memory of the dead, that their maker had believed time itself could remember what people forgot. Most nodded politely, though a few crossed themselves and muttered about restless spirits. But when the next chime sounded across the valley, even the skeptics fell silent, listening. It was early spring when the first real thaw came. Meltwater trickled down the path to the shed, and the air grew rich with the scent of wet soil. That evening, Tom unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the place wrap around him like an embrace. The light through the small window fell across the workbench where the unfinished clock had once stood. Now a new one sat there, gleaming. He didn't remember building it. Lily swore she hadn't either, yet it was unmistakably theirs. The brass casing shined differently, the pendulum weight engraved with a tiny apple tree, the same kind that grew in their orchard. It was the first clock that felt like it belonged not to Margaret, but to them. He wound it carefully and placed it on a shelf beside the others. The sound it made was softer, almost shy, as though learning to find its voice among the choir. That night, when the chime came, it was fuller than before. It carried not only the echo of memory, but the pulse of continuation. Tom realized then that the shed was no longer just a shrine to the past. It had become something alive again, something growing. Time had accepted them. From then on, the rhythm of their lives followed the clocks. Once a week, Tom visited the shed to wind them. Lily tended the orchard, planting flowers at the shed's entrance each spring. Emily grew older, and when she began to study mechanics at school, her teachers said she had an uncanny ear for rhythm and precision. She smiled and said she had learned it from her grandmother, though they all knew she had never met one. The house became a place of gentle routine, where the past and present coexisted without friction. Years passed, and the Forsters aged with the seasons. The shed remained constant, its timbers weathered but strong, the clocks within never faltering. Visitors came and went, drawn by curiosity, but Tom never let anyone else inside. "It's not for show," he would say. "It's for keeping things remembered." He meant it. Every spring, the flowers bloomed brighter near the shed's door, as though nourished by the ticking beneath the soil. Some nights, when the moon was full, he could swear the faint amber glow seeped through the cracks again, just as it had that first time, casting long shadows across the trees. When Margaret died, she had written in her will that she wished to rest near the orchard, though no one had honored it. Her ashes had been scattered elsewhere, the house sold without ceremony. But one morning, many years later, long after Tom's hair had turned gray, a letter arrived from the county clerk's office. It contained a single page discovered among old legal records, a note written in Margaret's own hand, never delivered. It read, "If there is anyone left who hears them, promise me only this: do not let them stop, for when they do, all that we were will vanish into silence." Tom framed the note and hung it above the workbench. That night, as the clocks struck 1:17, he whispered the words aloud. The shed seemed to listen. For a moment, he thought he heard another voice, old, tired but content, answering his own. He smiled, certain it was imagination, but comforted all the same. When Tom's time finally came, years later, Lily carried out his wishes exactly as he had written them. His ashes were placed in a small urn beside the workbench, next to Margaret's photograph and the first clock he had ever wound. The shed was locked again, but only gently, as one closes a door not to seal it, but to keep it safe. Emily inherited the house. She was no longer the curious child who had once drawn clocks in her notebooks, but a woman who understood the value of remembrance. She unlocked the shed one morning and stood inside for a long while, listening. The air was thick with the scent of oil and wood, and the clocks greeted her with their steady, familiar rhythm. She touched the nearest one, smiling as it answered her fingers with a faint vibration, a heartbeat caught in metal. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm still here." She spent that day cleaning and polishing, just as her father once had. She didn't need to read the journals to know the story. It lived in the sound that filled the room. By nightfall, the shed glowed faintly again, the amber light flickering against the window. The chime came, as it always had, but this time it carried a new note. Clear, bright, young. The clocks, it seemed, had accepted another keeper. The villagers soon noticed the change. Some claimed that the chime now sounded sweeter, less like morning and more like a song. Others said it was imagination, that the sound hadn't changed at all, only the ones who listened. But those who stood close to the orchard at night swore they could hear something beyond the ticking, a murmur of voices woven through the rhythm, not sorrowful, not joyful, but eternal. In the years that followed, the house became known quietly as the keeper's home. No one dared disturb it. Travelers passing through the valley sometimes stopped to hear the chime at night, unaware of the story behind it, unaware that within those walls, time itself was not a straight line, but a circle, where love, loss, and remembrance flowed endlessly into one another. And even when the world outside grew faster, when clocks became digital and silence harder to find, the shed remained unchanged. Its gears turned, its pendulum swung, its voices whispered. At precisely 1:17 each night, the orchard would glow faintly for just a moment, and the air would tremble with the sound of hundreds of clocks ticking in perfect harmony. No one ever heard them stop again. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Watch our next videos, each one more shocking than the last. And if this story amazed you, share it with your friends. Let them find out.